The Death Railway, they called it. A blooded trail 258 miles long, claiming the lives of thousands of prisoner-of-war detainees and innocent people. It was a scene of unquestionable torture, and a scene that simply shouldn't have happened. The Japanese fleet had made record advances and had hit the Allied forces swiftly and mercilessly by the late spring of 1942. Areas that were considered strongholds fell to the Japanese forces, and any of the troops not killed in the conflicts were captured. Although official counts couldn't be verified, it was estimated over 140,000 Allied troops were imprisoned on top of the 130,000 innocent civilians. The conditions the captured had to endure were some of the worst to come out of the war. Troops fared worse than civilians, but all were subjected to torture, malnutrition, and over-excessive correctional punishment. Japan made steady progress across the Malaysian campaign, and it wasn't long before the army had its sight set on Burma. Burma at the time belonged to the British, but the Japanese forces knew that a lot of resources lay in that soil, something that they had to have. There was also a secondary motive for the capture of Burma. The Allied forces had built a road, and its use was threatening to hamper the Japanese program, including the taking of Singapore. The Allied forces managed to hold its own over the sea, cutting off ties to Burma. The only other option, other than sail, was rails. The Japanese wanted to create a railway from nearby Thailand to Burma. The route planned would cross mountains, jungles, and a large river. But for the sake of the mission and the wider invasion to India, it simply had to be done. The fall of Singapore was one of the worst defeats in British history. Almost 50,000 British troops were captured, alongside tens of thousands of soldiers belonging to its Allied partners. There were so many prisoners that large boats were chartered to take them to Japanese labour camps and prisons. The cramped, dirty conditions allowed disease to run rampant, and almost 1 in 5 soldiers died on the journey. Many of the ships were diverted to Thailand and occupied Burma, respectively. 60,000 prisoner-of-war soldiers were unloaded and given new orders: build the railway. Joined by thousands of civilians, the soldiers were forced to work. The route was as bad as you could get. It was littered with hazards the railway had to overcome. Jungles full of mosquitoes that carried all sorts of illnesses, bridges over rivers that had to be built, and literal sections of mountains that had to be cut away. For most engineers, they would see it as an impossible job, but it was the most direct route. The work was scheduled to last a year. However, the Japanese forces were pushing to finish early. There was no medical help, little food, and no advanced tools, leaving the workers to dig using basic shovels. Then there was the torture. Workers were whipped on the regular. Stopping work meant a punishment, and mistakes could cost you your life. Meanwhile, cholera and malaria were common. Every 10 miles, the makeshift camp would be relocated. The camp would sleep thousands at a time, and the so-called tents offered no protection from the monsoon weather. On average, each prisoner had only 2 foot of floor space to claim as their own. The worst section to overcome was nicknamed Hellfire Pass. The rock had to be cut by hand, and any mistake or apparent slacking would be punishable. Over the course of the 12 weeks to cut the pass, hundreds died of the harsh treatment, disease, starvation, and exhaustion from the 18-hour workday. The track itself was a narrow-gauge track nearly 3 foot 4 inches, and most likely steam-hauled. After its completion, the captured were sent to relocation camps, where they would be called upon if maintenance was required. The Allied forces, of hearing of the railway, targeted it as often as able, but it was only after the war did the atrocities come to the surface. 23 Japanese commanders were put on trial just for the railway alone, with 11 going to face the hangman's noose. The Allied forces went alongside the railway and uncovered camps, but most importantly, uncovered mass graves the soldiers were forced to dig in an effort to hide the crime. But with an unknown number and location of these camps, the locations of thousands of people will never be known. The railway didn't last long, and parts were shut down by 1947, but some are still in use today. The parts that aren't used are still there and contain memorials to the victims. It was a mostly unknown railway. The Japanese kept the project top secret, with only a few allies and escapees told of the horrors that occurred there. In 1957, the railway was immortalised in the film Bridge over the River Kwai, although the river where the bridge resides is not called the Kwai. The film does an amazing job in depicting the conditions as the workers built the bridge. David Lean's masterpiece thrust the railway into the spotlight so much that the real river was renamed at that spot where the bridge sits. Today, the railway's construction and the treatment of the workers is considered a war crime, and there are many memorials dedicated to the people who died there. Some of the dead have been moved to the war cemeteries and identified where possible, but it's of little consolation to the families back home. In 2012, to mark 70 years of the railway's construction, the families in the UK were able to gather when a memorial was unveiled near Mornington Tube Station. The memorial features 2 rails and shows a stone plaque with an image of a worker drawn by one of the workers who managed to escape. As the number of workers alive that remember working on the line gets less every year, they can rest knowing that their children and their grandchildren will always remember them and the ones who didn't come home.